Hello, everyone. Today we're going to learn about file input and output, or otherwise known as file I/O. So far, whenever we've been working with data in class, you've always got your data from the user, or the data was hard-coded into the program. So now we're going to actually learn about getting data from files and also writing to files. So we're reading from files and we're writing to files. So you got file, so the file input is getting data from the files or reading from the files, and the file output is writing to files. So in terms of writing data somewhere, so far we've been printing results on the screen, but then it disappears after that. We never get to keep it anywhere. So now we're actually going to learn how to save data in a file, so you can preserve the data that you've been working with. So it's important to introduce the concept of a text file or a .txt file. So this is a very universal file format. There's nothing special about it. And it's the most common type of file that we're going to be reading and writing to. So it just contains data that's been encoded as text that we can read as humans. There's other kinds of data files that people can read and write to, but for the purposes of this class, we're going to focus on text files. Now, when we're accessing data in these text files, there's two ways to access them. So there's sequential access. So you read the files sequentially from beginning to end. This is like an old analogy. It's analogous to cassette tapes. So with cassette tapes, you couldn't just skip straight to a song in the middle. You had to fast forward or go from the beginning all the way to the end. Whereas the second way, direct access, analogous to a CD, you can jump directly to data, any data in the file. So for the purposes of this class, we're just going to be doing the first one, sequential access. So it's going to be quite straightforward. We're going to start at the beginning of the file and read sequentially all the way to the end. So this is a diagram from your Gaddis book. So we haven't gone over objects, object-oriented programming, so I don't want you to worry too much about objects. Although when we're talking about files, Gaddis does introduce it as a file object. We can just think of it as, for now, a data structure that allows you to access the data on your file. So the way that we start off reading and writing data to a file is we have a file variable. Here it's denoted by the variable name. And then we have open. And then we have the file name. So it could be like data.txt, test.txt. And then we have a mode like append, read, or write, which we're going to go over. And the file object is an object that is associated with a specific file, and it provides a way for the program to work with that file. So we always have three steps when we're working with data files. We open the file, we read or write data. We don't do both using the same file name. So we read or write data, and then we close the file. So let's have a look at opening the file. So we use this built-in Python function open. So we give it the file name and the desired file access mode. So we're going to look at many examples, but here is an example here. So we say, for example, variable equals open, the file name, and then the mode. So my file it can be any name. It doesn't have to be my file. Open. This is a .dat file. So imagine this said txt. So data file.txt. And then we just want to read from it, or we could put W for write or A for append. The file name will always be in, hopefully, at least in our class, in the directory as where you have your Python file. So it should hopefully just be a simple like mydata.txt. If it was somewhere else, you would then need to do the file path to wherever it was contained, like if you had a folder called data, for example. So let's have a look at some examples. So opening files. So if we say in file, for example, it could be any name. We have our keyword, Python keyword open. And then we have our text file, monthly rain.txt. And then we have an R for read. And you notice that all of these are in quotation marks. So this means A, that the file must already exist and it is read only. So this file monthly rain.txt exists somewhere, and ideally it contains some data that we want to read. So we're going to create access to it with this line. We say, give it some variable, and we're going to say we want to open this file and we're going to read it. So we say R for read. If we wanted to write to a file, then we would have some variable name, open the file name, and then W for write. Now, if the file doesn't exist, this line of code will create it for you. So if mydata.txt didn't exist, this line would create it for you. If it exists, it would erase whatever data is already on there, and then it would write new data onto it. So you got to be careful when you use W, that you don't want your old data to not be deleted. Now, if you wanted your old data to stay there, then you would need to use A for append. So if there was already data there, it would add new data onto the end of the file. So that's the difference between A and W. Again, with A, if it doesn't exist, then it will be created. Okay, so let's actually have a look at some examples of writing data to files. So let's start with a simple example and we'll do this together. So we have to use this built-in Python function write, and it will allow you to write to that file that you've opened. So for example, let's have a look at this together in Sublime. So we have, let me make this a bit bigger here. Okay. So we have some variable test file equals open, and we're saying test.txt, and W, we're going to write to it. Then we're going to use our built-in Python function write, and we're going to say write hello world. So we're going to write hello world to our file, and then we're going to close our file. So with files, you always want to close them after you open them. So the thing is, when you're reading and writing data, if you don't close your file, data can get lost in the process. Like for example, if you're writing data to it and you don't close it properly, then that data could get lost. So you don't want to forget your close. So let's actually run this. I call this io.py. Now you'll see that nothing happens in the command line, and that's fine because we're not trying to print to the command line or anything like that. Now what should happen is if you open up the directory where you have that code, so I have io.py in my in-class week 7 file path. So I have io.py. Remember, I've created this test.txt, right? You can see this here. You can open that up. So if you right click open with Sublime, you can open that up and view it. And there is your text file that says hello world. So congratulations. Hopefully that's worked for you. So let's go back to our slide. So you've written to a file. So now let's do 3 lines instead of just 1. So you can comment this out. And let's have a look at this example. So we're going to write 3 names. You can choose whatever names you like, but at the end of it, I want you to put in \n N for a new line. So let's save and run that. So again, nothing will happen in the command line. So we have to go and check test.txt. And because we use W, remember it's overwritten the previous data. And here we have the three names, Ada Lovelace, Grace Hopper, and Katherine Johnson, all women who have contributed to computer science. So we can see there that these three, so each of these is one separate line, and then we've done our, \n to add a new line. There it is in our test.txt. Now it says here, what happens if you remove the new line? So let's have a quick look and do that real quick. And save, and we'll run. And then we'll go and have a look. And you can see if you don't have your \n, it will put all of them on one line together. So that's not what you want at all. So if we undo this, and let's just run it again because we're going to want it to look like this for reading purposes later on. So bring it back to the way it was. Okay, great. Now, some limitations of this write Python keyword. So it only takes one argument. So you can't give it many things to write at once. Like you can't say write foo, comma, bar, comma, something else. But you can concatenate strings together with your plus sign. So you could say, write foo, concatenate, bar. It only takes text strings as its argument. So you have to remember that write isn't smart like print. So it doesn't convert things to strings for you. So your code, you must convert the data to strings before writing it to a file. So that's a really important one there. You must read and write strings to a file. So this slide has a whole bunch of possible mistakes that wouldn't work with write. So for example, here we have two variables A and B. We open up, say, to a file called results.txt, and we write. And if we say A comma B, that will give you an error. It's more than one argument. If you say A plus B, you can't do that because they're not strings. We haven't done lists yet, but if you created a list and then you try to write a list, that wouldn't work either because that's not a string. Similarly, if you just try to write A, that wouldn't work either because it's an integer. So let's look at some things that would work. So if we go over here and comment these out, and we bring these up. So here I have A equals 42, B equals 37, and I'm going to write to results.txt. And here I'm going to say string. So I'm going to convert A to a string, concatenate. I'm going to put a comma, and then I'm going to concatenate with the string casting of B. Then I'm going to do a new line, and then I'm going to actually add A and B together, and I'm going to convert the result of that to a string, and then I'm going to close my file. So let's actually see what happens if I run that. So remember, this is going to print to a new text file, results.txt. So you'll have to open that up. If you go to your file manager, you'll have to open up your results.txt, and you should hopefully get something that looks like that. And if you look at your code and make sure you understand why it's printing that out. Okay. Now let's look at reading data from a file. So as we said before, when you want to read, you have to use the R for your mode. Now there's two built-in Python functions here. There's read and read line. So read takes the entire file as a text string, and read line takes one line at a time. So we're going to look at read line, for today. So let's have a look at this example. So I think it's going to be best if we do this in Sublime. So we have read file equals open. Now let's use test.txt. So make sure that it looks like this. We're going to read from this file. And remember with R, it has to already exist. Then we're going to create a variable line1. And we're going to say read file dot read line. So we're going to read one line, the first line. So remember, it's sequential. So we're going to read one line from our file. Then on our next variable, we're going to read our next line. Then the third line, we're going to read our next line. Then we're going to close. And then we're going to print these variables, line 1, 2, and 3. So let's do that together. And this is what we get. Right? So we get Ada Lovelace. That is the first line. So it reads the first line. And then you see we have this space between the two. Then we have the next one and we have a space. Then we have the next one and we have a space. So there is a blank line after each line in the output. And this is because each item that is read from the file ends with a new line character, the \n. So remember when we created test.txt, we actually, let me comment this out so you can see this again. Remember when we created test.txt, we used this code with the \n. Now, if we go back to test.txt, now if we go back here to read.py, remember when we print, that also gives you a new line. So we're having two new lines. We're getting a new line from line 1, which is giving you a regular new line after every print. And we have this additional \n. So it's giving you two new lines for each line. So a very standard way of dealing with that is we have to take away the \n. So we introduce another new built-in Python function called rstrip. So that stands for write strip. So it's going to strip any characters from the right-hand side of a string. And when we do strings in great detail, then we'll learn more about these built-in functions for strings. So you can see here rstrip, rstrip, rstrip. So each variable, so we say line1 equals line1 dot rstrip and the \n. So we're taking away that \n from each one. So if we go back here, if you add in those lines of code and run them, now you don't get those extra empty lines when you run your code and print it to the terminal and read from the data. All right. Now, these last two slides are very important because we have to know how to work with loops when we're reading and writing data from files. So this slide is on for loops and this slide is on while loops, and you are expected to know both and how to use both and the differences between the two. So let's have a look first of all with reading data from the file with a for loop. This is actually copying data, so it's reading data from a file and then it's writing it directly to another file. So it's almost doing like a copy. So we have a variable read file that opens up test.txt. So remember that's this file that we're using. And we're also going to write to a new file that at this point for you won't exist, called write_test.txt. So that's going to have a different variable name, and that's write. So if I actually open this up here, you'll be able to see it here better. Then we're going to have a for loop. And this is the part that's really important that a lot of students takes a while for them to get. So here the target variable line is going to contain each line of the file for each iteration of the for loop. So you can see here that we have this read file. So this is our variable here that's for test.txt, remember. So line is going to be each line of test.txt. So on the first iteration of this for loop, the value line is going to be Ada Lovelace. On the second iteration, let me put this next to each other. On the second iteration of this for loop, line is going to have the value Grace Hopper, because that's the second line. And on the third iteration of the for loop, line is going to have the value Katherine Johnson. This is really important, so please feel free to rewind and watch that again to make sure that's really clear for you. So on the first iteration, line is going to have the value Ada Lovelace. So when we go to write, so we say write file.write, so we're going to write to this text file. We're going to write Ada Lovelace. And for good measure, we're going to print it as well. Then we go to the second iteration, line is going to have the value Grace Hopper. So we're going to write Grace Hopper to write underscore text.txt, and we're going to print it. And then we're going to do the same with Katherine Johnson, and then we're going to close the files. So let's have a look at that one. So here are the printouts, and there are gaps in between because we didn't do the R strip. And then let's actually look at write underscore test.txt. And you can see here they are. There they are. So we've taken the contents of test.txt and we've copied them to write test.txt. Yeah. So we've done that with a for loop. Now it's important here, I said no need for read line. So that's the important thing to remember is when you're using a for loop, you don't need to use read line. If you do that, it's going to skip another line because the for loop actually takes you to the next line in the file for you. And here, each iteration will reference the next line in the file. Now, here is the while loop that does the same thing. So let's have a look at that. So let me comment this out. And let's look at the while loop. Okay. So again, we open our two files, test.txt and write test.txt. Now, the first thing we have to do is read a line, the first line. So we assign that to line. And then we say, while line is not equal to empty string, we're going to keep doing everything inside. So we're going to go and write that line. We're going to print that line. And then we actually have to read the next line again before continuing the while loop. If it's not an empty string, we're going to carry on and do it again and then read and keep going. Now, the nice thing is that in Python, the readLine method returns an empty string when it has attempted to read beyond the end of a file. And this makes it possible for us to write a while loop that determines when the end of a file has been reached. So remember that with our for loop, it would work out the end of the file for you. But with the while loop, we have to do that. And that's why we use this empty string. Be careful not to put a space here. It has to be an empty string. So, and this is very classic with while loops. You do one read outside of the while loop, and then you do one inside of the while loop at the end. You have to do one at the start so you can actually enter the while loop. And then we close. So if you run that, you'll see that it does exactly the same thing. So these are a little bit tricky and involved. So make sure that you understand the difference between the for loop and the while loop. And make sure that you actually do these exercises so you get familiar with reading and writing to files.